G'day and welcome to the Other Side Interviews. I'm Damian Coory and this is our weekly interview show that streams every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. on ADH TV and is on demand for you to watch or listen to anytime you like on ADH or your favourite podcast platform. Tonight we're going to take a look at an issue that affects all of us, Australia's housing shortage. With the government cracking down on coal and gas exports, Australia doesn't have much left to build its wealth on or grow its GDP. Add to that our massive state and federal government debt, rising interest rates on the repayment of that debt, and there's only one way to avoid us going down the gurgle, you might think, and that is opening up to more immigration, letting people in to bring their wealth and their labour and ingenuity to keep Australia's economy from sliding backwards. But that can cause social problems, especially in a country that seems to have little respect for its own culture and heritage and is having enough of its own identity problems already. Add into that the fact that we have a housing shortage and inflation that is sending the cost of housing for the people who already live here through the roof, and it's a bit of a dangerous recipe. So we need to fix that housing shortage and bring rental prices back down somehow. My guest tonight is the Chief Executive Officer of the Real Estate Institute of Queensland, one of the country's premier real estate industry bodies, Antonia Mercorella. Antonia, thank you very much for taking the time to join us on the other side.
Pleasure to be here.
I just wanted to basically firstly ask you a summary question. We know we've got a problem. If someone just said to you, what's the fix in 60 seconds from your perspective, could you answer that?
Well, we do know what the fix is. It's supply, but of course we know supply is the answer, but getting that supply to market is quite complicated. I think there's a number of things we have to do. We need to bring investor confidence back in this country. That's a fundamental problem we have at the moment, and that investor confidence is being eroded, of course, by rental law reform that's sweeping the nation and a number of other factors. Interest rates coming back up quite significantly is playing a role. I think we need to do more to address the fact that we know we have an ageing population in this country. We are not focused enough on finding ways to encourage older Australians to free up those big properties with nice big backyards, which are of course ideal for growing families, and helping them and encouraging them to move into age-specific or dwellings. And of course, we need to do more to encourage first-time buyers. There seems to be this sentiment sweeping the nation that young people feel that they're unable to access the market. We need to do more to encourage them into home ownership if that's what they want. And of course, we need to make sure that we've got our policy settings, our legislative settings and our regulatory settings right to encourage builders to build more. And of course, we need government to start playing its vital role in terms of social housing. Again, government has not been doing enough to meet its responsibilities in that area. Okay,
so you think it's really a two-prong approach. The social housing, the safety net, government does have to step up on that level to solve that sort of end of the problem where people are really desperately in need. But we also really, first of all, probably have to put the emphasis on the private sector. Obviously, the Greens and Labor have a very different perspective. They see housing as a social responsibility of government, perhaps in their ideology, particularly the Greens. And they would be they're pushing, in fact, for a lot of government interventions. But those government interventions, as often is the case with government interventions, have unintended consequences, and we're ending up with a situation where a lot of those initiatives are putting investors off. And that is killing supply even further and making the problem worse. So if we look at this in economic terms as a supply problem, not enough supply, prices go up. You talked about investor confidence. Why do you see, or where do you see investor confidence being most affected at the moment?
Well, I think investor confidence is being eroded in a number of ways. There's no doubt that APRA intervention has played a pretty instrumental role in denting that confidence. The banking inquiry certainly didn't help. And then, of course,
APRA being the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority,
correct.
So they're responsible for regulating the banks.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's impacted confidence.
Well, what we saw with the APRA intervention is, of course, they started to play a role in terms of controlling how much banks could lend, to investors changing the rules when it came to investor lending, making it much, much harder. And we did see that had a fairly significant impact on investor confidence and on investor lending. And then, of course, what we've seen is this legislative reform that's been sweeping the nation. And of course, now the federal government has also announced that through National Cabinet, it also intends to play a role in that space. At a more local level, we've recently seen the Queensland government proposing and indeed passing some really interesting taxation reform with that multi-jurisdictional land tax. Now, that was repealed, but again, that had very detrimental impacts on investor confidence. But when you look at really what's happening, is you have this raging anti-property owner sentiment that's sweeping across Australia, and it's really quite disturbing. And what we're seeing is state and territory governments constantly looking at ways that they can boost and enhance tenant rights and protections. And let me be really clear in saying that we believe that there needs to be some fundamental statutory protections in place for tenants. Yep. But of course, that needs to be very delicately balanced against the rights of property owners who ultimately do own what is an asset.
Yeah.
And I know that that is often frowned upon. I appreciate that it is a home, and whilst it's being rented, it is a home for a tenant, and that's important to acknowledge, but ultimately it's an asset. There's been a financial risk that has been assumed and continues to be assumed, and I think we need to recognise that. So when we are creating these reforms that strip property owners of some pretty fundamental rights and decision-making powers, what we're seeing is this erosion in control that they have over their assets. And I don't think we can underestimate the impact that that has. We just recently conducted an investor survey, and again, the theme in that was this constant view that, or this theme that emerged, that is, I feel as if the government is taking away all of my rights,
right,
and is saying that it is my responsibility to provide this housing.
Yes.
Without any rights at my end, and I think that's problematic.
Well, of course, and there's a market out there for investors' money, right? And if the stock market is saying, hey, invest in us, it's a lot easier, more liquidity, easier to do, we won't tax you at every turn, you know, you don't have to worry about tenants, we're going to give you a return, then people are going to put their money in the stock market, or they're going to put it in overseas or something else, overseas property even now.
Well, we're already seeing that happening.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
okay,
of course,
so therefore, investors are not going to be investing. It is a competitive marketplace, and there's got to be some return on investment. Otherwise, why invest? Now, the Greens will say, well, stuff the investors, because they have a fairly simplistic worldview, and that everybody should be given social housing. But even if we were to take that approach, someone's still got to pay for that social housing paid for by taxpayers, right? So where is the tax money going to come from? It doesn't solve any problems. It just pushes the problem around. The economy is the economy, and the reality is the reality. And if there is no return on investment, you know, then people are going to invest elsewhere. The prices are set by the marketplace. And yeah, it is a lot harder for kids today to get into a property. I heard something on the radio, they were talking about intergenerational theft, this idea of intergenerational theft. And I'm a Generation X, so I sit in between the two generations that are fighting over this. But is that a true concept? I mean, this idea of intergenerational theft, I mean, did the boomers really steal from the millennials? Well,
I think the boomers get blamed for a lot, and I think there is a perception. I have a 19-year-old son at home who sometimes also espouses those views. I think we've got to recognise that prices are going up, and I can understand that there are many who are watching those prices and are feeling like they're being priced out. I think that's something that we need to address. I think it also comes back to something that I'm concerned about, about, and that is the lack of education
Yeah.
that is delivered through schools about budgeting and about basic economics, life economics, which I think is very much lacking in this country. But I feel like I could go off on a dangerous tangent.
Well, we do often on this show, don't worry. But I mean, we're looking at a situation where kids are getting taught stuff that is actually of a particular political ideological persuasion at school, and not being taught perhaps the stuff that would be more practical. And this leads to these very divisive ideas that one generation is stealing from another, which is another way of creating discontent, which we see the left side of politics wanting to do quite a lot, and the Greens playing on this idea, pushing this idea because they have the young voter base and they want to win that. And there's nothing kids like more than to hear that mum and dad are the ones to blame for the position that you're in. It's a pretty nasty, divisive narrative, though, and it's really not true, is it? Because I mean, we've got a country that's growing, and the size of the country, we have population growth. We're going to have more with immigration coming up because we have to maintain a certain standard of living. And this is, the kids are perhaps, laying blame inappropriately for why. What is the data on this? It's 11 times, is it, the annual income now to buy a house? And it used to be...
It used to be, I think, it depends on which era we're talking about. But yes, it's grown considerably. It's gone from about 6 up to about 11 or 12 times.
Right. But
again, it varies around the country as well. But just if I can pick up on a point there, I've actually heard rent being described as theft. Now, I think we've got to really understand what's at play here. The reality is, here in Queensland, for example, 36% of our population rent, slightly higher than the national average. So about a third of the population, roughly speaking, let's call it a third of our population rent their homes. And that is being provided by private investors, mum and dad investors. I think we've got to be very careful when we demonise property investors. Let's think about who we're demonising. We're demonising a group of people who do much of the heavy lifting when it comes to renters. Again, I don't have the national stats, but in Queensland, government provides under 4% of social housing, and the rest is left to mum and dad investors. So I think we've really got to understand that these are people who are taking on this property, buying the property, paying higher interest rates on account of being investors, often paying higher council rates on account of being investors, paying land tax, and of course that's not taking into account the stamp duty that they're paying, again at a higher rate because they are investors.
Capital gains tax.
Capital gains tax at the other end if you sell. Now, yes, there will be people out there who argue that they get the benefits of negative gearing. I acknowledge that, but let's recognise the risk that comes with being an investor. Now, again, I've heard it argued that investors are only interested in capital growth, that's all they're concerned about. Well, quite frankly, that's not the case. Investors don't have the luxury of just the holding costs and the responsibilities that come with a property, and then in the hope that later down the track there's some capital growth. Now, there may be capital growth, but of course, for those of us who have been around for long enough, we know that there are property cycles. Yes, one can do extremely well out of property, but not always. That's not a guaranteed income. So I think we've really got to stop and consider this. I've also heard this very interesting argument that if investors were to sell, so when we argue about the denting investor confidence or perhaps driving away investors, the argument is, well, that's a good thing. Let's drive away investors and allow more people to buy. Now, of course, we're the REIQ. We are supportive. We want to see more people buying, but I think we have to be realistic about this, Damian. There are people who wish to rent, they choose to rent, and then we've also got to recognise that there is a proportion of renters out there who simply won't meet the criteria to become homeowners, unfortunately. They won't be able to get that home loan because the bank won't lend to them for a range of reasons. And I think we've got to be really careful about being so critical of these what we refer to as being the rental suppliers in this country.
Yeah, right, the rental suppliers, I like that. And it doesn't matter if it's mum and dad investors or if it's a big corporation, really, at the end of the day. I mean, these are the people taking the risk. They're entitled to a fair return on risk.
I think so.
And if the return isn't there, they're going to put their money, as I said before, they're going to put it in something else. They're not going to enter into the property market, and this is what we're seeing. We're seeing building approval numbers going down quite sharply, right? How much of that is driven by investors pulling out as opposed to other forces?
Well, there's a few things at play at the moment. So we know that investor confidence is absolutely being shattered by the constant legislative reform that we're seeing and hearing about on a daily basis over the course of many years. I think also what's playing a role here is that people are afraid at the moment to buy off the plan. We're hearing stories of builders going bust, and of course the construction crisis and the cost of building supplies, the shortage of labour, that's all playing into that confidence piece where people are afraid to buy. And we do know that often when developers construct these new, when they're building these new complexes, apartment complexes or new builds, often they are relying on that investor market. Yes, of course, there will always be some owner occupiers there too, but the investor market is really critically important to the developer at the other end.
The inner cities of our major capital cities in Australia, particularly Melbourne and Sydney, are now dominated by federal teal MPs, who I believe are, fairly left-leaning, despite their claim to be sort of teal. In Brisbane, we didn't see the teals run, and we've got 3 federal electorates covering most of the inner metropolitan city, or all of the inner metropolitan city. The whole thing is green. And these are green because the teals didn't run, they've gone to the greens. This mentality that we've got in the inner cities, are we going to see a solution that's going to work, do you think? How is this going to play out politically? And what's the sense you're getting in how the politics of housing has changed in say the last 5 years?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. If you look at the Greens, both at a state level here in Queensland, but also at a federal level, they're running on this platform that is very anti-property investor in nature. So they're, of course, calling on rent freezes. They want to see the introduction of rent caps. They want to see the implementation of no grounds evictions. And if I can pause for a moment, because that definition of no grounds eviction concerns me. I think it's misleading language.
Yes,
we're not where it conjures up images of a property owner waking up and simply deciding that out you go. Which of course there are statutory protections, as there should be, against that kind of conduct. What it really means is that at the end of a fixed term tenancy agreement, that an investor may decide that they don't wish to renew that agreement.
Yes.
Now that's a right that both parties have and should be retained. And so there's an argument that a property investor should be stripped of that right, and therefore once a tenant is in, that tenant should be allowed to remain in place until it suits them, and that an investor can only terminate that tenancy on very limited grounds, and they may be things like wanting to sell the property or they themselves want to move back in. Now, I think we're really starting to get into very dangerous territory when we start to dictate terms like that, effectively giving a tenant a unilateral right to stay as long as they wish, and saying to an investor, that's the tenant that you'll have to keep in there until it suits them.
Well, I think the kids, and they are kids, and the Greens don't quite understand, is that, you can mess with the rules, but you can't change economic reality. It's like gravity. You apply all of these things, and people are going to disappear, right? People are going to stop investing. And we have a supply problem. This is a supply problem. We need people to invest in the property market to build and to grow. And there are already, all of these inhibitors at the moment. Let's talk about the rent freezes just for a second. I mean, this is, in economic terms, this is just good old-fashioned price control. Government coming in and saying, well, we're capping the price there, like they're doing with some commodities at the moment, which is a bit concerning. This is socialism. It doesn't work. Just tell me a little bit about the impact that just the talk of these rent freezes is having, and to what extent they have been introduced around the country at the moment?
So what we've seen is across most jurisdictions, we've now seen governments moving to limit the number of times rent can be increased. So across most jurisdictions, you've now got that limited down to once every 12 months. We've got here in Queensland, those new laws will start on the 1st of July. And quite concerning, I will say, is that they're actually retrospective, which is causing all manner of strife at the moment, but that's another topic.
Well, let's actually go into that, because I think that's quite interesting, and this could happen in other states, right? Because this is the stupidity of government, right, playing itself out in quite a big way. So the government's gone and said, okay, this is a great idea. We're going to make it that you can't increase the rent any more than once a year. And of course, governments never think of the unintended consequences, the things that happen as a result of their decisions that sound good at first glance, and then you put it into place and you think, oh, we didn't think of that, right? And what's happened with this is, by making it well, I'll let you explain it, but they've made it retrospective, which is strange in itself.
It's mind-boggling is what it is. And let's keep in mind that, if I just quickly take you through the timeline, so we had the Premier come out and say that the government was looking at introducing rent caps. Now, that took us by surprise because, of course, we'd already seen 2 private members' bills introduced by the Greens, proposing rent caps and rent freezes, and a parliamentary committee which was headed up by their own party member had actually said and stated rent caps don't work. In fact, they will potentially exacerbate the issue. Yeah. So it was concerning to see our Premier coming out with that. And shortly thereafter, she then said, no, what we'll do is we'll introduce a limit on the number of times rent can be increased, and we'll rush that through very urgently. And extraordinarily, what we saw the government do was to tack on some amendments to a bill that was already in the House, and those laws passed the very same day. So without any consultation, none of us got to see the proposed amendments beforehand. No consultation, no regulatory impact statement, no parliamentary committee process, none of the normal checks and balances that one would expect and one is entitled to expect in Australia. Simply went through.
Or the good management would demand.
Well, that's right. And what we then saw is when these laws were passed, of course, we discovered that they were retrospective. And so, just in simple terms, what that means is that you've now got a situation where lessors, property owners, have lawfully negotiated a rent increase under today's laws or under the past or the laws that were relevant at the time, and they're now prevented from being able to, after the 1st of July, they're not able to affect that rent increase. So, albeit that they've budgeted for it and they've done all the right things, they now can't go ahead and actually implement that rent increase, which is pretty extraordinary, because it's one thing to make a law and say the rules will change from this day and then you can plan. Henceforth, the rules shall be this. This is saying we're changing the rules, and we're going to change the rules in a way that affect past decisions that have been lawfully made and agreed to between the parties. So this is pretty extraordinary stuff in my mind.
So if you've already negotiated that rent increase for the year, you now can't implement it.
That's right.
It's unbelievable. Okay, so how many people is this affecting? I mean, I would imagine not many, because most people wouldn't put the rent up more than once a year.
Well, that's the really interesting thing.
Help?
Well, this is also where you wonder about the thought process and how much planning goes into this, because you're right. What we know, there's no hard statistics available on this, but we do know from anecdotal feedback that, as a general rule, usually the rent goes up once a year. Usually, there are some instances where and indeed, because of the rental market conditions, we've actually seen a number of property investors say, how about we do it in 2 instalments, rather than doing it all in one fell swoop and a very significant price increase.
Usually to the benefit of the renter.
Correct. Let's do it in 2 parts.
To help the renter.
Correct,
right. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? And so I suppose the government just thinks, oh, this will look good in a press release. Let's make this announcement. It won't have
Well,
much real
I
impact.
think there's a lot of, I think what we're seeing across the nation at the moment is some knee-jerk reactions. We're all talking about the rental crisis. We're all talking about rents skyrocketing. We're all talking about property prices. And I think government is constantly looking for a quick win, something that will get them through the day. But of course, those decisions come back to bite us. And it's where consultation is so important.
Yes.
Because what seems to work on paper doesn't always work in the real world, unfortunately.
No. And I guess it does come back to that idea of the mentality being, in Australia these days, and we talk about a lot on this show, is, the government ought to fix everything. The government ought to intervene. The other government ought to fix it. The government ought to fix it. The government ought to fix it. It's like, no, the government can't fix everything. The taxpayers are out of dough. We are now massively in debt. We've got to start looking at letting the market fix things and try to attract investors to do this stuff, to do the building that's needed. Let's talk about what the barriers are that could be easily removed at the moment in terms of, let's say you had a developer that came along and said, okay, there's a demand for affordable housing. I'm going to buy a big tract of land somewhere and I'm going to subdivide it and I'm going to build affordable housing for people. Or there's a train station, right? I'd like to do a medium density block of apartments next to that train station. That's a hub that'll solve transport problems. It'll be affordable because it's out in the suburbs perhaps. As countries grow, as cities grow, as we've seen in big cities like New York and London and everywhere else, the prices go up to live closer to the city, and generation after generation you have to move further and further out, or you have to move upwards. There is no avoiding this is the reality of population growth and the fact there are more humans and less space. It's not intergenerational theft. But what's stopping the investors at the moment, do you think, that could be removed easily that would inspire investors to do, okay, we're going to do these developments that the government wants or that the public are demanding of more affordable housing?
Well, I think, what I will say is there's been a lot of talk about build-to-rent schemes. That seems to be, I think it's being perceived as a panacea, and I don't think it is that. I think there's absolutely room for build-to-rent. We know, however, that at the moment the settings aren't appealing. There are now changes afoot to make that more appealing, and I think build-to-rent has a really important role to play. We know that that's going to be institutional investors as a general rule. That's another interesting debate that many would argue institutional investors are far more responsible and ethical over mum and dad investors. I would argue that's appropriate, but I think
they're professional. I guess.
Of course,
they're good at doing things effectively. They want to extract the maximum.
They may be able to do it at a larger scale, greater efficiencies. I agree with that, but I think this perception that mum and dad investors are nasty and don't care about tenants is not. Well, there's always exceptions to the rule. I accept that. So I think build to rent absolutely has a role to play. We know that developers look for investors. What we've got to do, though, is bring back confidence. As I was saying earlier on, at the moment, we've seen a lot of big builders go bust.
Yes.
And so what we're seeing is people who have got vacant land are actually sitting put at the moment, or they're selling that land because they're not confident about building at the moment. And I think what we're seeing really is that there's a real level of, I think there's a bit of a holding pattern that's happening across Australia at the moment, because we're all talking so much about this housing crisis, and there are round tables and housing summits happening all over the country. I think we're all holding our breath a little bit to wait and see what happens, because you've got local government on a daily basis coming out with some interesting things. We're seeing local governments starting to crack down on short-term letting in backyards, calling on residents to dob in a neighbour, so to speak. You've got more and more local governments charging higher rates for investors. In Queensland last year, we saw that what we deemed to be an outrageous multi-jurisdictional land tax regime that had been proposed, and indeed the laws were passed but subsequently repealed. So I think what we've really got to do is
the multi-jurisdictional land tax, you mentioned it earlier, I just want to explain it a little bit, but basically it was to say that if you own a property, because currently if you own a property in one state and you own a property in another state, they don't add them together to work out if you've passed the land tax threshold and you've got to pay land tax.
That's right.
But what they were going to do was start doing that, right? They were going to say, okay, well, you got one in Queensland, but we're going to count this one in New South Wales you got as well. We're going to add them together and charge you tax in Queensland.
Right. It was
Oh, God. Okay, yes, more complexity.
Fortunately, it was repealed. But having said that, what I will say is it was repealed, but much damage was done nonetheless.
Right. Right. Yes. This is the thing. It's confidence, right?
It's confidence.
It's all these little knocks to confidence.
As we keep saying,
I can tell you from personal. I'm out of the investment market, right? I used to own 2 investment properties in Australia, and I lived overseas. But I now live here. I bought a property, but I'm not going to buy any more investment properties because it's just not worth it. Now, the Greens would say, well, good, you're
part of a growing trend of people who are doing that.
Creepy rich guy, you shouldn't be able to buy any more properties, stuff you, and isn't that great? But it's like, well, no, because who's going to build the property? Who's going to give you the supply? Where's it going to come from? Anyway, it's frightening stuff. It really does concern me because I'm not, I'm not unusual. I think there's, as you say, I think there are a lot of people, and you've probably got the data on that there are a lot of people that are thinking the same way. And this isn't going to solve the problem. I guess what I'm trying to get at with the question I asked before about, what could be done to kind of incentivize investors.
Sure.
Can we get rid of some regulation? Can we get rid of some tax?
Absolutely. There's all sorts of things we can do to incentivise. I think we need to focus on our ageing population and look for ways to incentivise. We have seen the federal government do some of that in terms of superannuation changes to encourage older Australians to sell. I think more needs to be done.
To sell and downsize.
To downsize, that's right. Okay. So I think that's...
Because the move in aged care is to get people to stay at home longer.
Well, that's right, but I think we need to. But I think we need
the home needs to be different.
Well, I think and we need to get better, to be fair, at building homes that perhaps are more that age with you, so to speak. But I think more needs to be done in that area. I think we need to also be looking at it. Controversial, but we say it, let's incentivise more investment. So instead of actually charging investors a higher level of stamp duty, why don't we actually charge less stamp duty, but on the basis that those properties are made available on the permanent rental market? Now, again, that seems to be frowned upon when we suggest more incentives for investors, but I think realistically, that's what we need. Unless we're going to see the government sweeping in and suddenly start constructing huge amounts of new social housing and affordable housing and buying those properties from existing investors, I'm not sure how we go about housing our growing population.
Well, government can't afford to do that. That's the other thing.
Government
we don't
can't
have the money.
afford to do it.
The Greens will be saying the government should do it, the government should do it.
Well, that's all well and good, but we've got to be realistic about this.
Yeah.
And so I think finding new ways, and back to what we were talking about earlier on, what can we do to actually help people transitioning from being a renter into home ownership if that's what they want? What can we be doing to encourage younger Australians to buy that property? I think more could be done. We know that that stamp duty is a very significant financial impost. If you think about it, around the country you've got people paying rent, and in some cases those people, if they could somehow overcome that obstacle of stamp duty and the obstacle of the deposit, then we could get them into home ownership.
Right.
So why aren't we having that conversation?
Yeah.
Why aren't we looking for some creative solutions instead of blaming the pesky investors who are stopping those first home buyers from being able to get that first foot onto the ladder?
With all the increase in housing prices in Australia, we haven't seen stamp duty rates come down, have we? So this has been a massive windfall for state governments.
Windfall for state governments all around this country.
To what extent? Do you have data on that? Just off the top of your head? Is it like...
I should do.
No,
I don't. I'm sorry. But
it's,
what I will say is,
high, right?
I will say property is the backbone of state and territory economies in this country.
Yeah. Okay.
Again,
hello.
Yes.
Yeah, you want young people to be able to get into their own home. It would help if on $1 million house, they didn't have to pay, what is it, $50,000, $60,000 worth of stamp duty.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are some, to be fair, there are some stamp duty, depending which part of the country you're in, there are some stamp duty concessions for first home buyers, but again, depending on the value of the property, they may or may not apply, or they may come in at a different tiered level.
Right, okay.
But of course, that 20% deposit as well that's generally required for that bank loan, that's the big stumbling block as well.
Okay. Now, is it necessarily possible for Australia to maintain the level that it has of home ownership? Do we have to accept that as a growing country, as a maturing economy, that we are going to see more renters like you do all around the world?
Look, I think that's probably the reality. We are seeing the level of our rental population is incrementally increasing. Here in Queensland, it's up to 36%. We have one of the highest rental populations in the nation. I do think more people are wanting to rent. I think what's happening is many of us have grown up with that dream of home ownership. We talk about it as being part of the Australian psyche, the great Australian dream to own. But the reality is that younger generations don't necessarily have that same obsession or desire to own. They're looking for greater flexibility. And I think we've got to start looking at renting in a different way. I think there's been a tendency to look down at people who rent, but there's plenty of people who are choosing to rent and investing their money in other ways. And then we're also seeing this interesting trend that's emerging of rent vesting, where people are saying, well, I can't afford to buy in the suburb that I want to live in or the type of property I want to live in, so I will rent that instead, and I will go and invest where I can afford to invest.
Right.
And so, yes, you're getting some, you're acquiring an asset.
Yep.
But you're actually renting
where you want to live and paying that extra to live in that city.
And your personal preferences are being satisfied through renting.
Yeah, I mean, renting provides enormous flexibility. A lot of people don't want to be burdened with a house. Not everyone's into spending every Saturday at Bunnings. There are a lot of people who, no offence to people who are either, right? It's great fun. But there are also a lot of people who move around for work. Yeah. I mean, I've lived in 6 cities in the last 20 years. I've rented most of that time.
That's right.
It's very hard to own property when you're doing that.
Well, I think most of us have rented. As adults, I think most of us have rented. I find it amusing when politicians come out and say that they have a unique insight because they've rented or they are renters. I think you would struggle to find most adults in this country who haven't rented at some stage in their lives. I don't think it gives you a unique insight with respect.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I think also, you know, we've all experienced bad landlords. We've all experienced bad tenants if we've been landlords. We've all experienced good landlords, good tenants. It was like any other market, right? Maybe we just need to leave it alone for a little while, a little more laissez-faire approach, do you think?
I think so. I think this is a really important point. I think, again, I go back to the Queensland experience. We've got about 650,000, 650,000 rental properties in Queensland. In the majority of cases, those relationships between the property owner and the tenant, they work well. They're respectful relationships. The tenant wants something. The property owner, if it's a reasonable request, as a general rule, says yes. The renter pays their rent on time, looks after the property.
It's the magical invisible hand of the free market.
It's the magical formula.
Nobody respects anymore.
But of course, we recognise there are always going to be those exceptions.
Yes.
Those landlords who don't do the right thing, and just as you've mentioned, some tenants who don't do the right thing. I think we need to be very careful about legislating for a minority of cases and creating these broad, sweeping legislative reforms to cater for exceptional circumstances. I think instead of constantly legislating and constraining what parties can do in that relationship, I actually think we need to do the opposite. I think we need to start allowing greater contractual freedom in that space. And I think when we start doing that, we'll actually see that we'll probably end up with longer term relationships. I'll give you an example of what I'm trying to articulate here. Bonds are very strictly limited and constrained in most parts of Australia. As a general rule, it's limited to 4 weeks worth of rent. Now, that's not always sufficient, and because it's quite a limited amount of money, you'll often find that that is what prevents property owners from saying yes to certain things, because the risk that they assume with that, they don't feel that it's sufficiently going to be mitigated by access to that bond at the end.
Right. Okay.
So why not allow that if a tenant wants to have a pet, that okay, well, I'll say yes to that pet, but here are some conditions, and that might include taking a pet bond, for example, which is generally not permissible in Australia. So it's just one simple example.
Yeah, we're preventing creative solutions that might benefit both parties in the arrangement. That they could be able to come up with themselves like adults without government intervention.
Well,
heaven forbid.
That's right.
We should permit that in Australia. Okay, so you're a bit also concerned. You said to me before the interview that you're a bit worried about the vibe of the thing, so to speak, to borrow a popular phrase, that there's a stakeholder tension, like, you know, that people in the market now are not feeling great, that this division and this hostility is there between the tenant and the landlord, and that this whole debate and the interventions by government are not actually improving and moving us towards a healthy state of affairs in terms of those relationships, and that concerns you, right?
I think so. I think there's this us and them mentality that has emerged, as if we're pitted against each other, which is really unfortunate, and again I don't think reflects the reality of the vast majority of tenant and landlord relationships. And I think it's quite dangerous, and you can feel it kind of raging and building, and it's being driven by, I would argue, people who don't actually understand the commercial realities of tenancy relationships, the commercial realities that come with being a property owner, and even if I think about our own experience at a local level, we are the Real Estate Institute of Queensland. We are not anti-tenant, despite the fact that we have been characterised in that way by many stakeholders and by, in some cases, the media.
The tenants are very important.
Why would we be anti-tenant? And we don't represent property owners. We represent property professionals who facilitate those relationships. Yeah. And where I'm going with this is, I think historically, we've sat on a number of stakeholder groups where we work with people who represent tenants, with people who represent the most vulnerable in our community. We work really closely with organisations that are disability peak bodies. And we've historically worked incredibly cooperatively and productively together. But I think in recent years, those relationships have been really strained, and it's become clear that you need to be very black and white in your view, and that there can be no shades of grey. And I think that's incredibly dangerous, and it's very, it just ends up creating a very non-productive set of circumstances where people become very positional in their bargaining and won't budge and look for common ground. I think we've historically been able to find a lot of common ground. You know, I always say probably a successful negotiation is one where everyone has to give up a little bit of something and feels a little bit aggrieved, but you've got a little bit of something, but you had to give something up. Whereas at the moment, whereas at the moment, it's all or it's nothing. There can't be any in between, which I think is concerning.
Yes, it's almost like that division's being driven by a particular side of politics in order to benefit politically from it, but I won't go there. All right, Antonia, we've talked about these concerning rental law reforms, the fact that some of them are retrospective, all of this being related to supply, damaging supply. The problem is supply. What are we going to do to get more places built? So it's a combination of, I think we've discussed getting rid of some of the tax barriers, providing incentives for investors to build, particularly the style of housing that we need.
Yeah.
And the style of housing that we need is affordable housing, right? Simple, basic, affordable housing at different price points, right?
Absolutely. I don't think we've done a good enough job in this country of considering the changing needs and unique needs. I think we tend to build more of the same. What we know is that there are fewer of us living in our homes now. The average number of people in a dwelling is down, and of course COVID had a fairly significant impact on that. So we know that one-bedroom dwellings can be hard to come by. There's plenty of a particular type of dwelling, but we're not doing a good enough job of working out where the needs are. So I think we need to get better at that. We also need to, I think, as a country, accept that we have a growing population, and this obsession that we have with a freestanding property with a big block and plenty of room to move. Sadly, that comes with a price that many can't afford. So I think building up is something that we've got to start embracing more of. I think smaller...
I find it fascinating that the Greens are the ones who, you know, are pushing this ideal of the great Australian dream and the house and the quarter-acre block. It is environmentally the worst way to develop a city. If I think of, I lived in Hong Kong for a long time
Yes.
as well. That is a city where 7 million people live up in the sky because they've got a very narrow strip of land about 10 kilometres long on a mountainous rock. And, it's wonderful. Everybody lives in there. There's one train line. The trains just come continuously.
And it works.
And it works. I mean, it's very crowded. I'm not
Yeah,
suggesting
of
we go that
course.
way. But you can be 2 minutes, you walk up the hill and you're in the bush.
You don't need a car.
It's beautiful bushwalking.
You don't need a car.
Don't need a car. It's a fantastic and great lifestyle for a lot of people. Not for many people. I mean, it's not perfect. And it isn't nice really living in a crowded city, I guess. But, we're nowhere near that problem. But we need to stop the sprawl, right?
Well, you can't have it both ways.
No.
You can't have it both ways. I think we can all agree that having having shelter over our head is essential. It's something that I think every single Australian deserves. But I think we have to be realistic. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should all be living in apartments. That's not what I'm suggesting. We live in an extraordinary country, and I think a freestanding home is something that, particularly if you've got a growing family, is something that I think is important. But my point is we need to get better at embracing different types of accommodation, whether it be townhouse living, units and apartments that are close to the city so we don't need a car, and that might be more suited to a particular demographic, for example.
Or units and apartments close to train stations outside the city, right? Further out.
Yeah, that's
let's
right.
start doing medium density train stations so we're reducing transport problems. I do think that a lot of our immigrants, and we're bringing in, if we're going to bring in, we've got 700,000 since COVID, there's another 700,000 in the next couple of years. If we're going to have that bigger percentage increase in our population, a lot of those immigrants are going to be coming from Asia, South Asia. They're used to living in density properties. They don't mind living in apartments. And in fact, a lot of them I've spoken to prefer it for security reasons. And if we have increasing crime, there's going to be more concern for security. People are going to want these apartments, right? And some of them.
But we have this there's this NIMBYism that exists where people say we don't want that in our backyard. We don't want that, or we don't want to see our country becoming filled with these apartment buildings. And I think you're right.
These might be the teal voters, Antonia.
Well,
these might be the green, the inner city rich,
the security that comes with an apartment, the low maintenance factor. One of the biggest groups is of course this over 55 females. Over 55s, that's that big group of growing homelessness is coming from there. That's a great option in terms of security as well. So I think, again, we've got to stop thinking about it as what's my personal preference? What do I want to live in? Because that's what we should be building more of. I think we've got to get better at working out who lives in our community and what are their unique needs, and what are we going to do to actually build homes that meet those unique needs, rather than just keep building 3-bedroom houses that are outside, that aren't affordable for many or aren't located in a convenient position. So I would say it's all interconnected. There's no point in building things in the middle of nowhere where you can't get to anything. There's no amenities, there's no schools, there's no public transport. So we've really got to get better at all levels of government working together. We need local government to start playing a more critical role here as well. We know that local governments, councils around Australia, you talk to anyone who's built and they'll tell you about the red tape that they encounter and the amount of money involved and the time factor involved.
Red tape and green tape.
Correct.
Throttling things.
Yeah.
And it's rent seeking. It's taking money. That's the kind of rent seeking that we need to clamp down on, right? The taking of money for no reason at all other than a rubber stamp. Just before we finish, I want to just talk about this 55, females over 55 demographic you pointed out, and that problem, that issue. It's a serious social problem. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, what we know about this group is, of course, they've dedicated their lives in many instances to being to looking after their family. They don't necessarily have super. They don't have the super nest egg. They're not necessarily skilled for the types of jobs that exist today, and so they're left in the cold. And of course, we've heard these extraordinarily sad stories of women living in cars, not being able to find jobs, and of course what we've recently seen is the RBA governor has come out and said, well, we need people to start thinking about living with others, so co-tenancy arrangements. Now, we would agree with that, but you can imagine it's very difficult for a woman at over 55 to suddenly be trying to rent with a couple of 20-year-olds or uni students. That's not really what you want to be doing at that age. So again, the challenge is, how will this woman, who probably doesn't have a history of renting, probably doesn't have necessarily a history of a good, solid wage on a weekly basis, that weekly salary, they're finding it extremely difficult at the moment to find a rental property, and of course home ownership for them is often out of reach.
So this is an empty nester demographic that is single.
Absolutely.
Whether divorced or widowed or whatever.
Divorced, widowed, whatever the case might be.
And it's a phenomenon of women, not men?
No, it's definitely, I'm not saying that it doesn't exist with men, but what we are seeing is that it is women at that over 55 age group, that this is a massive, there's organisations that have all now gathered around this.
Wow. Okay. Housing for them perhaps is what we need to think about. Been fascinating talking to you, and it's great to have you on the other side. So particularly, I mean, this is what we try to do, look at the other side of issues. It's very easy and simplistic to say, you know, to dumb everything down to, you know, some rich person's being mean and greedy, or the government's not doing the right thing, and then there's some social problem that results from that, and there are victims of that, and poor them. It's very important to go deeper and understand the dynamics and the complexities of these issues, because that narrative, that old, I hate to say it, lefty narrative of, you know, rich versus poor, you know, there's always an oppressed and an oppressor. It's just not the case. There are lots of people trying to do the right thing, and we've just got to get the balance right and be moving in the right direction. And quite often government, I guess, makes things worse when trying to make things better, unfortunately.
I think balance is the key term there.
Yeah, well, as it is with everything, isn't it?
Indeed.
Antonia, lovely to talk to you. I'd love to have you back sometime again in the future.
I'd love to, thank you.
Great to meet you. So folks, that's it for the show for this week. We'll be back next Tuesday, of course, with the Other Side interviews. And don't forget, Friday night, our main show, The Other Side Australia, your weekly shortcut to a summary of the news of the week from a classical liberal, slightly different perspective to what you get in other media. But that's ADH TV for you, and we're here for you at all times. Don't forget our motto, don't just like it, share it. We can only continue to grow the alternative and independent media in Australia with your support, helping us to build and grow, and letting people know by word of mouth that we're here and available. And you can download, of course, the ADH TV app on your phone, on your iPad, on your computer, and you can watch us online on any web browser at any time you like at adh.tv, adh.tv, no .com or anything like that. And best of all, you can download the ADH app on your smart TV if you've got a really smart TV. There are just a few that don't have us on there yet, but we're just about on all smart TVs. So if you are buying a smart TV, make sure it can get ADH, and you can download our app and enjoy all of our programs with a lovely Netflix type interface. All right, we'll see you soon. Have a great week, and we'll catch you Friday night.